right, Concord family. Everybody doing good out there? Well, if you haven't already, turn with me to the book of Esther. That's where we're going to be hanging out today. And for those of you who are joining with us for the first time in a couple weeks or the first time ever, this is week 2 in a series through the book of Esther. And while you're getting there, just a quick recap just catch you up to speed on where we've been so far, because Esther's a very unique book, mainly surrounding the fact that God's not mentioned in this book. And so to begin last week, as we begin to dive into this book, we gave you some tools, and I want to revisit those just for a minute before we dive into our message for today. Here are some tools that we looked at for reading the book of Esther that are really, really important, especially when you're coming to the Bible expecting it to be God's word, which it is, but then you don't see God mentioned. How do you read a book like this? So here are some tools to carry with us today and as you continue to read this book. First of all, reminder, Esther is a book of theological inferences, not statements. And we talked about kind of the difference between those last week. A statement being a clear, pointed decree about what is true and not true. An inference is something you have to come to based on the clues that you're given. And so the book of Esther invites you to look for God's activity in between the lines. And one of the ways that you can do this is kind of look for ironic coincidences that begin to occur. And we're going to see that start to take place today. Another really important tool that we talked about last week, and I would want us to remember together, is that God is the hero of this story, not necessarily the characters. There are good characters and there are bad characters, but the good characters might not always do the right thing. And the book doesn't necessarily call out what's right and wrong. What we're supposed to see is how God is working in and through the story to bring about his plan, which is this last tool right here. And this one's really important. It's going to come into play today, so remember this one. We got to remember the big picture, where Esther falls in the grand story of God, that God has promised to use Israel, that Israel is a central part of his plan to rescue the world from sin. And because he promised that, he must continue to protect them. This is the idea that we get behind remnant theology, that God always sees the people group of Israel through history leading up and into Jesus. And so that's very, very important for today, and I'll bring it back up once we get there. So last week, those are our tools. Last week, some of the main ideas that we got from the first 2 chapters of Esther were maybe some lessons learned, were that we see that God is obviously not evident in this book because he's not mentioned, but that doesn't mean he's not present. And that's something we have to remember as we go through this book. We also saw how God begins to use anyone at any given time to do anything as he sets up Esther and Mordecai to take a huge part to play in this story as it unpacks. We saw the lesson given by Mordecai there at the end of what we talked about last week, that pursuing holiness, even in the middle of hardship, is so vitally important. It's so easy to lower our standards when things get so difficult to see, when things get foggy, when we're not sure what God's doing. It's easy to lower our standards, but we see Mordecai step up and do what is right. And ultimately, that led us to kind of walk away with the challenge of, hey, we can trust God even in the things we can't control. And we've got to learn to do that. And even when it gets tough and when it's foggy and you don't know what's going on, you don't see what God is doing, you can trust him in the things that you can control, to take steps of obedience, even if it's one step at a time. So those are some of the things that we talked about last week. And with all of that in mind, we begin to move into the real meat of this story. If you've never read through the book of Esther before, it gets really interesting here. We've seen the characters kind of be introduced to us. We see the things begin to take place. What we're going to see today, and what Georgia did just a great job of kind of getting us ready to see, is that a plan is about to form. An evil scheme is about to form that involves killing God's people. And at the same time, as we see this, as this is unpacked before us, we're also going to see that God is continuing to move in the background and use Mordecai and Esther in this plan. And so that leads us to the main idea that I want us to be thinking about as we work through the next couple chapters today. And it revolves around this question: what does it look like to let God use me? And I think this is a really, really good question, because I think it's one that many of us have asked before. Let me just poll the audience. How many of you, show of hands, would say at some time in your life you remember desperately wanting and desiring and praying maybe that God would use you in some awesome way? How many of you have thought or prayed that before? Yep, me too. Now, let me ask another question. How many of you can think back to a very specific time where you now, kind of hindsight being 2020, you're certain that God did use you to do something? Show of hands. Very cool. And how did that feel? Just like blurt out feelings of what comes with seeing that take place in your life. Peaceful. What else? Amazing, awesome, fulfilling. Like, this is something that so many of us probably desire and pursue. But if we're honest, even for those of us who have seen God use us in something, maybe if we're honest, we still kind of ask this question, like, but how does it work? Like, how do I do it? How do I let this happen in my life? And so that's the question we're going to be unpacking today, and that's really kind of at the center of these next couple of chapters in the book of Esther. And so last week, just reminding us, and Georgia already did a great job, but reminding us of what's happened, we meet the messed up king Ahasuerus who wants a new queen. Esther, because of her beauty, both externally and internally, is appointed as the queen. And then the last thing that we left off with was Mordecai, this short little story of Mordecai, a Jew who's being oppressed and has been sent off into the exile and is underneath this really angry, drunk king. He acts righteously on his behalf. And that's where we ended last week. And that's a very important part of the story, and so is the Esther part of the story, because these will pay huge dividends moving forward in where the book goes. And so, much like we did last week, here's how things are going to work. I'm going to give you a point to either write down or remember, and then I want you to see it unfold as we take large chunks of the text together. So if you're a note taker, here's point number 1 that I want you to see today, and then we're going to read it. Point number 1, the enemy's purpose is to thwart God's plan. This is true and true throughout all of time, that the enemy's purpose is to thwart God's plan. And we're going to see that take place here in these opening verses in chapter 3. So look with me in verse number 1. It says, after all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. For whatever reason, he promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. The entire royal staff at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, because the king had commanded this to be done for him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. Now, pause with me here. Georgia already kind of, if you were listening and paying attention, she explained to us what's going on here. We're introduced, first of all, to this new character, a guy named Haman. Everybody say Haman. And he is promoted. We're not given the reason why. He's promoted by the king to one of the highest levels on the royal staff. And as a result, the royal staff is called to honor him and pay homage to him, just celebrating him for this accomplishment. But Mordecai doesn't do it. Now, this begs the question, why? And the text doesn't actually come out forthright and say why this happens. It just says that he doesn't. But the reality is that the author of Esther has left us some clues as to why Mordecai doesn't pay respects to Haman. Now notice with me, if you look back there in your text in chapter 3, we're given the ancestry of Haman there. Do you see it? You're told who he's descended from, and then that he is an Agagite. Now, before we unpack what that means, let me ask you a question. Who is the only other character in this story that we have been given their ancestry? Mordecai. Now, this is another Bible reading tool. We've got a lot of characters at this point, but these two guys were given their ancestry. This is an intentional act being done by the author of Esther, calling your attention to these two guys and their ancestry. So just a quick reminder, we talked about this last week. Mordecai, first of all, his name Mordecai is a Babylonian name. But the second thing we talked about last week when we were introduced to Mordecai and his lineage, here's just kind of the summary of what we were supposed to think and feel as we were introduced to Mordecai. It's that he has a kind of not so good family tree. That he's related to King Saul, and that he's related through that to the Benjaminites, which if you do your homework throughout the Bible, the Benjaminites in the book of Judges were really, really rebellious and almost got wiped out because of their sin. And then King Saul comes along, one of the surviving Benjaminites, and he's the first king of Israel. Now, let me poll the audience again. Was King Saul, the first king of Israel, a good king or a bad king? He was a bad king. And this is an important part to this story, and the reason why he was a bad king is because he was a very self-centered and disobedient king. Now, we don't have time to go back and read this whole story, but if you want to take notes and go back and do it on your own time, write down 1 Samuel chapter 15. That's where you see the final straw of King Saul's rebellion. And what you see in that chapter is that King Saul is ultimately rejected by God as the king of Israel because he blatantly disobeys God, actually for a second time. And what you see happen there is that God tells King Saul, hey, these guys known as the Amalekites are a really wicked and messed up people, and I need you to go wipe them out. Now, for some of us, that's strong language, and we have to remember that the Canaanites, specifically the Amalekites, were really messed up. Like, they were known for killing their newborn babies by throwing them in the fire and then having sex with whatever moves. That's what they were known for. And God puts his foot down and says, King Saul, I need you to take these guys out. We can't let them continue to have effects in the world. And King Saul doesn't do it. In fact, he lets some of them live, including their king, a guy named Agag. Now, why is this important? Because the Amalekites, whose king was Agag, came to be known as the Agagites. And what do we learn here in Esther about this guy named Haman? He's the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. Okay? So putting this right here in front of us, we've got two men with a bad family feud. Does that make sense? Mordecai, whose great ancestor, King Saul, wiped out a whole bunch of Amalekites. Not all of them. He failed to obey God in that. And then you've got Haman, a surviving descendant of that fight, who was a part of this evil, messed up lineage of the Amalekites. And so we know that these two people have a bad family history. And that's what's important of what's going on here. We see this family feud begin to develop. I heard Dr. Graffinino say it this way. It's like the Hatfields and the McCoys. That's what's going on here. It's brewing. And that's what the author wants you to know at this point. That's why Haman doesn't bow down and pay respects to, or that's why Mordecai doesn't pay respects to Haman. So with that in mind, let's see how the story continues to unfold. Look with me in verse 3. It says, the members of the royal staff at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why are you disobeying the king's command? When they had warned him day after day and he still would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see if Mordecai's actions would be tolerated, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him homage, he was filled with rage. And when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, it seemed repugnant to Haman to do only away with Mordecai. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout all of Ahasuerus' kingdom. In the first month, the month of Nisan, in King Ahasuerus' 12th year, the lot, was cast before Haman for each day and each month, and it fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Pause there for just a second. This won't come into play today, but what you're introduced to there is this Persian word pur. Everybody say pur. And it tells you what it means. It means lot, or for us, a die, like rolling a die. And this was a part of how the Persian Empire kind of planned out their calendar year with the staff officials. They would roll the die and to dictate which staff official kind of had a say over what would happen at different parts of the year. And that will come into play later. That's a key detail later on in the book, so just tuck that away. But that's what's happening. And so when it's Haman's turn to dictate what happens within the year, here's what happens. It says, then Haman, when it was his turn, and he rolled the die, and he got the 12th month, he informed King Ahasuerus, listen, king, there is one ethnic group who is scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, keeping themselves separate. Their laws are different from anyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction, and I will pay 375 tons of silver to the officials for a deposit in the royal treasury. And the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king told Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do as you see fit. All right, pause. Hopefully it's clear what's happening here. But just in recap, Haman, finding out that Mordecai is a Jew, he wants to wipe him out because his ancestors were almost wiped out by the Jews. Bad blood going on here. And so when the Persian court comes together, he devises his plan and gets the king's approval by law that the Jews are going to be wiped out in the 12th month. And then the rest of chapter 3, you can read it, are all of the official things that take place in order to prepare and make Haman's plan take place. Now, the point that I asked you to write down and think about as we read through this was this, that the enemy's purpose is to thwart God's plan. And hopefully you can see here that an evil scheme is developing, and it's to bring harm to Mordecai and some other people. And that's obviously an evil scheme, but there's an even bigger plot going on here. And we can't miss this. And in order to see it, we have to pull out one of our tools for reading Esther, which was the last one that I told you was really important today, and it was this. We have to remember the big picture, that the story of the Bible is one of mankind condemning themselves by turning their back on Creator God, and God deciding that he was going to rescue them from their sin. And one of the crucial parts of his plan to rescue them was that he chose the people, the nation of Israel, for no other reason than God wanted to use the nation of Israel as a part of his plan to rescue the world from their sin. And because God promised that, and that was a part of his plan, he must continue to protect them. And so with that in mind, we see that there is a much bigger evil scheme at work here than just something between Haman and Mordecai. Do you see that? Haman, yes, he's a bad guy, but he's not the true enemy of this story. Flesh and blood is not the true enemy in our lives. There is a deeper scheme at work against the true enemy of God. And through Haman, the enemy is trying to bring about the destruction of the Israelites, the people that God had chosen to bring about his plan of salvation and rescue. Now you might say, so what? Like, is what you're saying really that big of a deal? And it is, and I'll show you why. Keep your place here in Esther, put a bookmark, keep your thumb in it, whatever, and turn to the first page of your New Testament. So turn, if you're with me in Esther, turn now a couple good pages to the right until you get to the New Testament, where you get to the book of Matthew. And Matthew chapter 1 starts in the most riveting way possible with a genealogy and a whole list of this person gave birth to this person. And I know you love those parts of the Bible, but I want to point something out to you. It starts like this, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, and it says, and this is an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And we get this long list. And I want you to look down at verse 12. It says, after the exile, after the Israelites were kicked out of their land, which is the time period of Esther, remember? Jeconiah, who was the king, the last king before getting kicked out, he fathered Shealtiel, who fathered Zerubbabel, who fathered Abiud, who fathered Eliakim, who fathered Azor. And you're like, amen, what a word from the Lord. Now here's why this is important. From the guy named Shealtiel, you see that strange name there in verse 12? All the way down to Azor, all of those men lived in the Persian Empire. The enemy's purpose is to thwart God's plan. And if Haman's plan were to succeed, these men would have died and been taken out. The enemy's purpose is to thwart God's plan. That's because the enemy hates the things of God. And can I just tell you something as a result of that? You have an enemy who hates you because you image the Lord. He hates you, and he wants to thwart God's plan in and through you. And as we see this taking place in Esther's story, I want us to pause here for just a second and let it challenge us in this way. That we've got to recognize and be diligent to intentionally identify the enemy's work in our own lives. This is his purpose. This is what he does. In other words, you must actively be on the lookout for how the enemy is scheming to bring about destruction in your life so that your life is not aligned with God's good will for your life. He's actively doing this. Peter says it in this way. He says, be sober-minded, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, is like a prowling lion, roaring, looking for who he can devour. Listen to me, church. Remember, lions prowl. You don't see them coming until it's too late. Have you ever watched National Geographic? You know what I'm talking about? Like the antelope or whatever. I don't know what it is. The one that gets eaten by the lions is the one that's not paying attention and gets left behind. The one that's not alert, the one that doesn't stay with the flock, isn't aware, that's the one that gets taken out. And that's the picture here. The one who isn't paying attention and actively identifying what the enemy is up to. And if you're not doing this in your life, you're going to fall prey to the enemy's schemes. And you most certainly, as we think about the question we're trying to answer today, you most certainly are not going to be used by God in the way that you want to be used by God if you're being used by the enemy. So flip back with me to Esther. Now go to chapter 4 and look at how Mordecai responds to the plan that's set in place. It says, when Mordecai, chapter 4, verse 1, learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went into the middle of the city and cried loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, since the law prohibited anyone wearing sackcloth from entering the king's gate. And there was great mourning among the Jewish people in every province where the king's command and edict reached. They fasted, wept, lamented, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. There was a massive response to the enemy's work. And here's one more thing I want to point out as we talk about identifying the enemy's work in your life. Even more than identifying it, what we see from Mordecai is that he mourns it. He's not okay with it. Now, if you had a connection like Esther and you were like sitting enthroned over the government, you might feel a little bit different. But just imagine that if you hear that the government is planning to wipe out your family, it might be a little easier to mourn something like that. If the whole government was trying to wipe out your family, that might be something easy for your heart to engage with and mourn. But I want to ask you something. Do you let your heart mourn for the sin in your life? Do you view sin as the evil, sinful scheme of the enemy in your life? Do you mourn it? Do you view lust as a plan by the enemy to ruin and wreck your marriage? That's what it is, scheme. It's not just a bad thing. It's a plan by the enemy. Do you view gossip as a plan by the enemy to destroy people's lives? Do you view lying as a plan by the enemy to undermine your ability to have and foster true relationships? Do you view anger and bitterness and grudges as a plan to strangle you from ever finding true contentment? Because that's what they are. And we have to actively identify these and mourn them and say we're not okay with them. Paul says it like this: let love be without hypocrisy. Hate what is evil and cling to what is good. So you have to do more than just identify it. You've got to mourn it. You've got to hate it. And if you want to be used by God, this is the first step, that we have to be aware and alert to what the enemy is doing. But there's a second thing that we see and we need to recognize in this story. Point number 2 for us to look at as we read through chapter 4. Write this down or keep it in mind. God can work through people or despite people. God can absolutely and does work through people or despite people. In other words, God is going to accomplish his plan. You get that? There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's not the question. The question is, who will be a willing participant in the plan? That's the question. And it pans out as we look here in verse number 4. It says, Esther's female servants and her eunuchs came and reported the news to her, and the queen was overcome with fear. She sent clothes to Mordecai to wear so that he could take off his sackcloth so that he could come and talk to her. But he did not accept them. Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who attended her, and dispatched him to Mordecai to learn what he was doing and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Now pay attention to this conversation that begins to take place. Mordecai told him everything that had happened, as well as the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the royal treasury for the slaughter of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree that was issued and was being sent around for the destruction of the Jews, so that Hathach might show this to Esther, explain it to her, and command her to approach the king and implore his favor and plead with him personally for her people. Mordecai is asking, imploring Esther to approach the king for help. Hathach came and repeated Mordecai's response to Esther. Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to tell Mordecai. They're playing phone tag back and forth. And this is what Esther says. All the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that there is a law that applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard who has not been summoned. The death penalty is what is installed for them, unless the king extends the gold scepter, allowing that person to live. I've not been summoned to appear before the king in the last 30 days. And so Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. Pause here for just a moment, making sure we're all on the same page on what's happening. Mordecai and Esther communicating back and forth through a servant. Mordecai has pleaded with Esther to approach the king and on behalf of the Jewish people and say, ask for his favor, ask for his help. And Esther responds by informing both Mordecai and us, the reader, of the Persian law that says if you haven't been called on by the king, you can't go to him. That ain't how things work. And if you do go to him, the only chance you have to survive is if he graciously extends his scepter and says, all right, you're good, you can come in. Now look at Mordecai's response in reply to this. This is key to this point that we're looking at and in the story as a whole. Mordecai told the messenger to reply this to Esther, saying, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. And here's the main thing. Look at this. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place. But you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So much to unpack in these verses right here. Specifically this line right here. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come from some other place. So remember, we're reading a book that doesn't ever mention God. This moment is the author's way to scream at you inadvertently to see him in between the lines. Like, where else could help come from? But there's more that we need to take away from this moment. Notice that in the same sentence, in the same thought bubble, Mordecai is both begging, imploring Esther to step up and to save the Jews. And at the same time, he's confident that if she doesn't, God will take care of him some other way. God's going to accomplish his plan. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's not the question. The question is who will be a willing participant in it. And that's exactly what Mordecai says to Esther in that next line. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And this is the question that is before Esther. Your circumstances have brought you to this point, Esther. Will you let God use you? And this should cause us to really reflect on God's sovereignty in our own lives. That God is at work in the world, working out his plan and inviting us to take part in it. Which leads us to a few questions that I want you to ask yourself. Here's the first one. Where has God uniquely placed you? We're not all going to be able to dunk a basketball. We're not all going to sit on a royal throne like Queen Esther. But all of us have been placed uniquely in our communities with unique opportunities. And the question is, are you aware of that? Are you taking a moment to take stock and say, I've got a circumstance around me in which I can do something about it? One of my favorite pop culture ways that this idea has been expounded on and expressed through the last couple of decades has been through this jolly guy right here, Gandalf. It's been a long time, guys. It's been months since I've made a Lord of the Rings reference, so I don't feel bad about it. I'm due for one. So for those of you who are not acquainted with the world of Tolkien and this character Gandalf, there's a moment where he's talking with little Frodo and talking about all of the craziness that's going on in the world, the evil that's really beginning to rise up and try to take back the one ring of power in which all the evils of the world are kept. And Frodo has been tasked to hang on to this ring and to work out the plan of how to destroy it. And this is the quote that I love. I cannot read this quote or hear it in the movies without kind of tearing up a little bit. Frodo says, I wish that none of this would have ever happened in my time. And Gandalf says, so do I. And so do all who live to see such times. But that's not up to them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. I love Lord of the Rings, guys. That's really good. That'll preach. But really, maybe you need to prayerfully pause in your life and ask the Lord, where have you uniquely placed me? And what am I going to do with it? But there's another important question that you got to ask once you begin to take stock of your situation. It's this: are you available for God's agenda? Because you might begin to be aware of where God has set you up, but is your heart in a posture that's truly willing to be used by God? Or another way to ask it that's kind of sharp and provoking is this: would God work through you, or would he need to work around you? And you might ask, listen, I want to be used by God, but how do I know if my heart is willing? How can I make my heart willing? And this is a great question. And Jesus has a very clear, straightforward answer for you. He says, I want you to pray every day. And I want your prayer every day to be like this: Lord, your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Your way, not my way. In other words, an unavailable heart says, God, here's my plan, help me. An available heart says, God, what's your plan? Use me. Is that what's reflective of your heart? What will you do with the opportunities God has given to you? Is your heart available? And so we're answering this question: what does it look like to be used by God? First, you have to be aware of the enemy. You have to make sure you're not being used by him. And secondly, we have to recognize that God's plan is going on. It's happening. You have to make your heart available for it and say, your way, not my way, Lord, and be available to do it. There's one last thing for us to see very shortly in Esther's story here. Our last point number 3, write this down, keep it in mind as we read. It's this: that faithful servants are fully submitted. There's no halfway in. And this doesn't mean perfection. This doesn't mean if you don't have your life fully in order that God can't use you. But there's a difference between being imperfect and fully submitted. You could be fully submitted and not yet fully perfect. And this is what God asks. And so Mordecai and Esther are sending messages back and forth. Mordecai imploring Esther to approach the king. And this is Esther's response. Look at verse 15. It says, Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. And she said, go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. And after that, I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him. Full sin by Esther here, and in multiple ways. Esther makes the decision to take a risky step of faith here, saying these famous words: I'll go to the king, and if I die, I die. But more than that, more than being fully committed and submitted in that way, she also makes the decision beforehand to prepare herself for this by engaging with a fast and encouraging all the other Jews to do the same thing. Now, what we need to see here is she's not taking her actions lightly. And specifically, she's doing it through fasting. Now, obviously, we've pointed out that God's not mentioned here. There's no prayer here, but it's another place where you have to read in between the lines and understand that fasting and prayer always go hand in hand. That's what fasting was for. And if we read between the lines, we can infer the reason that these Jews are choosing not to eat. They're asking for the Lord's help in this moment. And next week, we're going to see Esther and Mordecai's plan begin to unfold, but we're going to stop here today and just let Esther's words here challenge us. And I think there's 2 ways that it can challenge us. Here's the first one. Maybe today you need to take or decide that you're going to begin to take risky steps of faith. That you're not going to stand in the comfort zone anymore. You want to be used by God. And here's what you need to realize. If we're answering the question, what does it look like to be used by God? Just here in Esther's story alone, we see the example, but it's all over the Bible. It's all throughout history. That when God uses someone to do something awesome, they occur almost always in moments of uncertainty and sacrifice. They're not when things are going great, and then you just get to put the cherry on top that God used you. God steps in and does awesome things when things aren't going great. That's why we need him. And it requires you to engage those moments with faith, trusting God and taking those steps. In other words, as you have prayerfully opened your heart to say, Lord, your way, not my way, give me an opportunity. You must decide in your heart, even before that opportunity arises, that your yes is on the table. Listen, it may be something nerve-wracking. It may be something incredibly unsettling, scary. It might require you to sacrifice something. But you know what else it might be? It might be small and seemingly insignificant. And the question that will come is, was this really worth it? Is it worth my time? Yes. Jesus teaches that the one who is trusted with a little is trusted with more. Whatever opportunity that God opens up for you as you begin to pray, Lord, use me. What's your plan? Use me. My heart's open. Where have you put me? What circumstances do I have a part to play in that are around me that you've planted me uniquely for? And as those circumstances become illuminated to you, don't opt out of those opportunities. So many of us ask, Lord, why haven't you used me? And it's because you didn't take the step. He's given you a step to take. We must mimic the heart of the prophet Isaiah when he says, I heard the voice of the Lord asking, who will I send? Who will go for us? That's all the Lord said. And Isaiah said, I'll go. I'll do it. Take risky steps of faith. But here's the last way that this should challenge us today, and what I want to challenge us going out of here and into the week. Can I encourage you to engage in prayer and fasting? We talk about fasting typically once a year during our 21 days of prayer. That's not the only time that we should be fasting, guys. Like, I know I'm about to call you to a 3-day fast, if you can. But that's also not the only time you should be fasting. Like, this was a discipline that people did. And this isn't a sermon on fasting, but here's just a quick reminder of what fasting is. What is it? Why do we do it? It's probably an uncomfortable spiritual discipline for some of us. And here's just a reminder. Fasting is a physical action that amplifies spiritual reality. Our physical hunger helps to intensify our meditation on certain spiritual truths. It is a physical discipline that says, I will not be captivated by any desire, even my need for food. God, I need you more than I need food. And you take the times that you eat and you replace it with times of prayer and devotion and submission to the Lord. And it amplifies certain spiritual realities in your life. Here's just a couple that we see throughout Scripture that you can be seeking as you fast. Your fast can amplify your total dependency on God. We see that in Jesus as he's tempted in the wilderness. Your fast can amplify a heart of humility. Guys, do you understand? For those of you who have fasted, you know what I'm talking about, how humbling a fast is. One day without food and I can't do anything. I feel like I can take on the world one day and then I don't get to eat lunch and it's just like, oh, the world's ending. It's humbling. And that's the purpose, is to put you in a place that says, I can't exist without the Lord, without help. It amplifies the importance of repenting from sin. That hunger in you, the feeling of being malnourished. And you need to be filled by what is good. It amplifies your desire for God's guidance and direction. Lord, I want your direction more than my own. And your choosing to put food aside is to amplify that. And ultimately, it is to amplify your worship for God above all things. Now, if we're trying to understand what it looks like to be used by God, we see Esther implementing it, and we must realize that this is a vitally important discipline to take part in. And so I encourage you, if this is not something you do on a regular basis throughout a year, maybe you should prayerfully consider it. To begin, anytime you make a decently significant decision, you engage in some form of fast. I'm not saying you have to take a month of no eating every time you need to decide what groceries to buy. But you know what I'm saying? When things are important, Lord, seek you in this. And here's maybe 2 ways in this week as we go together into a 3-day fast, Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday into Wednesday evening. You say, what should I be praying about? Well, hopefully you know what to pray for, but if you need a little bit of guidance, maybe you take what we talked about today and implement it into your fast. And during your fast, you pray, Lord, what is my next risky step of faith that you're calling me to? I haven't stepped out in faith in a while. What is it that you're calling me to do? And as you're praying that, here's another one, a very specific one that as your pastor, I'll ask for. Lord, how do you want to use me in our upcoming church plant? We're about to really get the ball rolling, especially in the coming new year with everything that's going to take place as we transition from being a campus to a autonomous planted church. We've got awesome people already ready to step up and take charge and lead on some things that we'll need, but it's a team effort. And I would ask you, pray, how can I be a part in the days ahead? Here's how we're going to respond as we bring today to a close. I had you guys, if possible, to come down and pray during the altar. We're going to pray again today, not over the boxes, but I'm going to call all of us church-wide to pray. And basically just to get a head start on some of these prayers, whether you are or are not going to take part in the fast this week, maybe can I just invite you, whether in your chairs, in the altar with your loved ones, maybe you need to start praying now. Lord, where have you uniquely placed me that I'm not taking advantage of for your kingdom? Lord, what is the next risky step of faith you want me to take? Is my heart available when that opportunity arises? I'm going to call all of us to do that. So I'm going to pray. And when I say amen, the band's going to begin to play a song of response. But I invite you, if you're able to get down there at your chair on your knees, pray, come down in the altar to pray, and you begin to pray prayers like this. Lord, what is my next risky step of faith? Am I available in the place you've put me right now to be used? Regardless of what it is, send me. I'll do it. We'll pray together and respond together in song, and then we'll be done for today. Let me pray over you.